The rain had been falling since before midnight. Not the soft, merciful kind that farmers pray toward the sky for in dry August heat. This was November rain, cold, relentless, the kind that finds every gap in roofing, every crack between planks, every seam in wool and boot leather, and the carefully maintained composure of someone who has something to protect. It came across the Virginia low country in sheets, turning the roads into black rivers of mud, filling the drainage trenches along Ashby Hill's outer fence until they overflowed and spread silently across the yard in dark, widening pools. The estate was quiet. The main house had gone dark an hour ago, candles extinguished room by room, beginning at the top floor and working down, the way a house goes to sleep when the man who owns it has drunk himself into something that passes for peace. The kitchen fire was banked. The dogs had retreated to the stable, their silence adding a particular emptiness to the night, the kind that a property usually fills with small animal sounds but tonight had abandoned to the rain. There was one lantern still moving through the estate. Small. Shuttered on three sides. Its beam cut forward in a single narrow line, close to the ground, low enough to navigate by without casting light against the walls of the main house or the labor quarters or any of the outer windows that might, in theory, contain a pair of wakeful eyes. The woman carrying it moved with the particular economy of someone who has spent years learning which boards creak and which staircases carry sound upward through old plaster walls. Her name was Margaret Whitfield. She was 31 years old in the November of 1848. She had come to Ashby Hill 6 years earlier to manage the household accounts and domestic inventories, the work that keeps a large estate running beneath the surface of what anyone with authority bothers to notice. She knew every supply number, every storage rotation, every column in every ledger that had ever been adjusted for reasons that were not quite what they appeared. She knew the estate's debts better than its owner did, because she was the one who read the correspondence and filed the responses and translated what the Richmond Bank's careful language actually meant when it used phrases like "we await your earliest attention." She was not Harlan Ashby's wife. She was not his blood relation. She was employed, technically, on a salary that had gone unpaid for 7 of the last 12 months, settled instead in room and board and the quiet, unspoken understanding that leaving Ashby Hill was not, for a woman in her position in Virginia in 1848, as simple as packing a bag and walking through the front gate. The world outside this estate had its own walls, less visible but no less real. She moved past the winter kitchen. Past the empty smokehouse building that the estate had stopped using 5 years before her arrival, too far from the main house, too expensive to maintain, its equipment long since rusted or repurposed. Past the second storage structure, the one the inventory listed as containing broken harnesses, 3 salt barrels, a collapsed workbench, and nothing else worth cataloging. She stopped in front of it. The door had a sliding wooden bar on the outside, not a lock, just a gravity latch that could be lifted without sound if you knew the angle, and she knew the angle. She pressed the door inward. She held her body in the opening to block the lantern's beam from reaching the exterior walls. She heard him before she saw him. Breathing. Controlled, but barely, the breathing of someone managing pain through the application of will rather than through any actual relief from it. She raised the lantern. He was in the far corner. Back against the wall. Legs drawn up. A piece of rough cloth pressed against the left side of his face, the cloth darkened in a way that had nothing to do with rain. One arm was held at the angle that means the shoulder has been introduced, violently and recently, to a direction it was not made to go. His clothes were soaked through. The cold of the space, old timber, unheated, the specific wet chill that never fully leaves a building that has absorbed years of weather, was visible in the slight, involuntary trembling of his shoulders. His eyes were open. He was looking at her. Not with fear. With something that had been fear and had been compressed through the preceding several hours into something quieter, harder to name, the expression of someone who has reached the outer edge of a capacity he didn't know he had and found, on the other side of it, a different quality of stillness. His name was Caleb. She was supposed to report him. The protocol was clear. A man absent from his quarters after nightfall, especially following an incident, especially with injuries visible from where she was standing in the doorway. The protocol was clear, and she had been a part of the apparatus that maintained that protocol for 6 years, and she understood exactly what the sequence of events looked like if she walked back to the main house right now and did what she was supposed to do. The lantern shook slightly in her hand. She was supposed to report him immediately. Instead, she stepped inside, and she closed the door behind her. You are watching Unmarked History. If you're here for the first time, subscribe. This is what we do. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Before this story can go forward, you need to understand where it takes place. Ashby Hill, in the autumn of 1848, was not a prosperous estate. It had the appearance of one, the long drive, the white-painted main house, the dependencies arranged in their proper geometric relationship to the central structure, the fields extending out in their appropriate directions toward the fence lines. From the road, it looked like a functioning Virginia plantation in the middle years of the 19th century, which is exactly what it was designed to look like. What it was, underneath that appearance, was a structure in slow collapse. The tobacco yields had declined for 4 consecutive seasons, a consequence of soil exhaustion that Harlan Ashby refused to acknowledge as permanent because acknowledging it would require capital he didn't have and decisions he didn't want to make. The estate's primary debt to a Richmond bank had been extended twice and was currently sitting in the particular administrative purgatory between active service and formal default, sustained by reports that the bank's representatives were beginning to read with increasing skepticism. There were liens on outer parcels. There were informal debts to 2 private lenders whose patience was expressed in correspondence that had grown progressively more formal over the preceding year, which is how private lenders communicate that patience is ending. The estate held 41 enslaved people in that autumn. 34 were in the field labor rotation, working the tobacco fields and maintaining the property's physical infrastructure. 4 were assigned to domestic work. 2 were skilled, a carpenter named James who had built or repaired nearly every wooden structure on the property and whose work showed in the quality of joints and the character of finished surfaces, and a man named George who maintained the farm equipment with a diagnostic intuition that had no formal name but that kept machinery running years past when it should have failed. The rest rotated through whatever the season required. Caleb was assigned to mixed labor, field work in the growing season, whatever Gale needed in the maintenance seasons, whatever came up. He had been on this estate for 4 years. In the official labor register that Margaret maintained, he appeared on 18 separate pages, assigned to different tasks across different seasons with the administrative efficiency of a system that saw labor as interchangeable and fungible. The official register contained almost nothing true about him. It didn't record, for instance, that he read. That he had, at some point in a history the register had no column for, encountered enough instruction to be able to move through a written document with the fluency of someone who did it regularly. The register didn't record the quality of his attention, the particular listening stillness that Margaret would come to know over years, the way he processed information whole rather than in pieces. It didn't record the systematic way he learned systems and the patterns within them, the kind of comprehension that builds quietly and reveals itself only in those moments when someone says something and the response lands somewhere unexpected in its precision. None of that was in the register. What was in the register was a name and an assignment and the column that recorded the various ways a human being could be classified as property. The overseer's name was Jethro Gale. He had been at Ashby Hill for 14 months, arriving from a neighboring estate that had contracted and no longer required his services. Gale was not a complicated man. His method was the method of unpredictability, the understanding that the most effective form of control is the control that cannot be predicted, that makes every moment potentially consequential, that keeps the governed in a state of sustained tension that prevents the formation of anything resembling settled routine or coordinated response. This worked, after its own fashion. It worked the way a badly maintained fence works, it functions until it doesn't, and the failure, when it comes, is not gradual. What had happened on the afternoon before this night, the specific incident that had brought Caleb, injured and soaked, to the corner of a disused outbuilding, Margaret did not know in its full details. She had been in the house office working through the winter supply tallies when she had heard something from the direction of the stable that had made her go briefly still at her desk, her pen lifted from the page. She had not gone out. That, too, was a learned behavior. What she had learned afterward was this, that when she went to the labor quarters at dusk with a supply notice, Curtis had looked at her. Curtis was an older man, 60 or close to it, with 23 years on this estate before Margaret ever arrived. He was not a man who communicated in excess. He had developed, over decades, an economy of expression so refined that most of what he said was said in ways that didn't use words. He looked at her, that evening, with an expression she had learned to read in the way you learn to read weather, not through a single sign but through a pattern of signs that together described something specific. Then he looked, briefly, toward the south yard. Then he went back to what he was doing. That was all. It had been enough. She cleaned the wound on his face in the light of the lantern she had set on the old workbench. She had brought a small satchel, the kind of preparation that, if noticed, would have no innocent explanation, which tells you something about the state of her thinking on the walk through the rain. A cloth. A small jar of diluted turpentine. A strip of linen. He made no sound while she worked. The split above his jaw was deep enough to scar but not deep enough to require anything she couldn't provide. She pressed the cloth against it. She worked by feel and by the narrow lantern light, aware the whole time that the lantern itself was a problem. That old smokehouse timber, cured by decades of heat and smoke, was the kind of fuel that one unattended flame could end without much negotiation. She examined the shoulder. Not broken. Wrenched from its socket and then, evidently, not fully reduced, it had a position that was slightly wrong, a slight outward set that would be painful for weeks and would affect his range of motion in ways that would be noticeable if anyone was paying the right kind of attention. She found herself thinking about this practically. About who would notice. About what the explanation would need to be. She was already doing the calculations. One night, she said. She meant it to be a statement of the situation's parameters. A definition of what this was. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the specific care of someone whose head movement is currently expensive. She left him the supplies she had brought. She checked the door. She moved the broken workbench at an angle that would, in daylight, make the far corner slightly less legible from the threshold. She went back to the main house through the rain and she noted nothing in any record. That was the first erasure. It was not, at the time, a decision she experienced as consequential. This is something worth sitting with, that the choices that rearrange entire lives never announce themselves as such. They arrive as small practical decisions, temporary, manageable, bounded. They reveal themselves as something else only in retrospect, only when enough of them have accumulated to constitute an irreversible direction. She did not know, on that night, that she was making a choice she would still be living inside 7 years later. She did not know that the situation in that smokehouse was going to require more of her than anything else in her life. She only knew that she had gone inside. And that she had closed the door. One night became 3 days. This happened the way that temporary arrangements become permanent, not through any single decision but through the accumulation of circumstances that close off other options one by one until the temporary is the only structure left standing. The first constraint was weather. The rain continued for 2 full days without meaningful pause. The yard became a field of mud. The roads leading away from the property were rivers. Moving him in those conditions, in daylight, in sustained rain, was not feasible. The second constraint was Gale. By the morning after the incident, Gale had reported the absence and organized what passed on this estate for a search. He walked the outer fence line. He checked the obvious hiding places, the creek bank, the storage sheds nearest the quarters, the tree line along the eastern pasture. He questioned Curtis and 2 other men from the labor quarters in the particular manner that these inquiries took at Ashby Hill, which left Curtis with a cut above his eye and the 2 other men with the specific silence that follows a certain kind of conversation. Margaret read Gale's report to Ashby afterward, in Ashby's study, from the desk where it had been left, as she read everything that passed through that desk, which was the source of most of what she knew about what was actually happening on the estate she administered. The report concluded that the man had run north during the night. This conclusion was wrong. It was also, for the moment, protective in a way that Margaret understood with cold precision on the second morning when she brought a small supply to the smokehouse. If Gale believed he had run, the search was oriented outward, toward roads, toward county contacts, toward the infrastructure of the fugitive recovery system that Virginia maintained with considerable efficiency. That orientation meant the search was pointing away from the estate. Which meant as long as nothing changed the direction of that search, the smokehouse was in a blind spot. She sat in the smokehouse for a few minutes on the second morning while the rain came down outside. She told him what the situation was, not the emotion of it, not the weight of it, but the specific facts. What Gale's report said. What the search's current orientation meant. What would change the direction of the search if it happened? He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He's already looked here. Yesterday morning. Opened the door, checked from the threshold. The bench. It was enough. In the dark, with the bench at that angle, the far corner doesn't read as occupied." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking, not the performed thinking of someone constructing a response but the actual mechanical process of a mind moving through variables, testing options, arriving at conclusions she could follow partly by watching his face and partly by noticing when the stillness that preceded speaking changed quality. "He won't look again soon," he said. "Not unless something gives him a reason. Which means we give him no reason." "Which means we give him no reason," he agreed. There was something in the structure of that exchange, the two of them running the problem in parallel, arriving at the same conclusion from different angles, the natural movement of people who think in similar registers. She noticed it. She did not say anything about it. She left him the corn she had brought, and the water, and she went back through the rain. Something had changed between the night before and that morning. She could feel it in the specific way one feels a shift in weight, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but with the steady certainty of a center of gravity that has moved and is not going back. The first week established the operational skeleton of the system that would run for 5 years. Supply was the first problem to solve. Margaret managed the household kitchen accounts, which meant she controlled what was ordered, what was received, what was dispensed, and what was recorded as dispensed. She had been managing these accounts with a certain creative latitude since her salary had stopped coming, small amounts taken across multiple stores, spread across entries, erased in the difference between what was ordered and what was notated as consumed. It was a small, invisible fraud in the context of an estate that was conducting much larger, less invisible frauds at every level. She extended this principle. Dried goods first. Corn, beans, dried fruit, the kind of goods that existed in sufficient quantity that small reductions were absorbed into the general noise of storage shrinkage and measurement imprecision. Cured meat more carefully, from the back of the cellar stores, under reclassifications she entered as spoilage. Water was solved by the cistern channel in the smokehouse's northeast corner. She spent an evening with a broken ceramic vessel and river sand from the drainage ditch constructing a filter that produced something clean enough to drink, something that required no accounting entry and left no trail. Fire was the harder problem, and the more dangerous one. He could not have an open flame in that building. This was not caution, it was absolute fact. The timber was old and heavy with decades of absorbed smoke and dry in its interior in ways that the wet exterior concealed. She solved it over the course of a week with a tin box she found in the storage cellar and a set of small tools she had legitimate reason to be using, working on the modification in the evenings at her desk in the house office, fashioning perforations with a heated nail and shaping the ventilation channel with careful, patient attention. The lamp that went inside the box was small. The light it threw through the perforations was minimal, directional, narrow, insufficient for anything beyond reading the nearest surfaces. But it was light. Warmth was solved more slowly, wool scraps from the textile stores she managed, a pallet of straw that she constructed incrementally over weeks, small quantities moved across enough time that no single supply entry would read as anomalous. By the end of the first month, the smokehouse had a water source, food supply, light, and basic shelter from the cold. She had also, without announcing it as a decision, brought him 2 books from the estate library. Old volumes, chosen with attention, books whose absence from the shelf was legible only against the background disorder of a collection that had never been properly organized. She left them without comment. She did not know whether they were wanted. She did not know whether they could be used. She came back 3 days later. Both books had been read. She knew this not because he said anything about them, he said nothing, but because they had been replaced on the small shelf she had constructed with the careful, deliberate placement of someone who has handled something they were uncertain they had the right to touch. A specific positioning that communicated, I used this, and I understood that I was borrowing it, and here it is returned. She brought 2 more books on her next visit. She did not say anything about them. Neither did he. That, too, was a kind of language. Winter settled over Ashby Hill. December brought the particular cold of Virginia's interior, not the killing cold of northern states but a steady, pervasive chill that got into everything, into the mortar between chimney bricks and the gaps in window frames and the ground beneath the estate's outbuildings. The fields went to frost. The trees along the eastern fence line lost their leaves and stood in the white sky like the masts of stranded ships. The tobacco had been cured and baled and the bales were in the drying barns, waiting for the transport that would take them to Richmond in the late winter. The work on the estate contracted. In winter, there was less field work and more maintenance, fence repair, equipment upkeep, the chopping and stacking of firewood that a large estate consumed in prodigious quantities across the cold months. People moved in smaller ranges, staying closer to heat sources. The outer yard, the south end, the old smokehouse, the collapsing garden wall, was less trafficked than in other seasons. This was protective. It was also, in ways that took Margaret time to fully reckon with, its own form of pressure. Because winter on a working estate also meant that the rhythms of the household compressed, that people were inside more, that the domestic spaces were more occupied, that the movements of the people who managed things were more visible to each other, and therefore required more careful management. She developed the warning system in December. It began as something she noticed herself doing before she had named it as a system, that she moved differently on mornings when everything was normal versus mornings when something was wrong. The difference was subtle, a slightly different pace, a slightly different angle in the way she carried her lantern on evening trips, a particular quality of deliberateness in her approach to the smokehouse door. She had not invented this. Her body had. He told her, one morning, that he could tell the difference from the sound of her footsteps on the frozen ground before she reached the door. Not the words she said or the way she looked when she arrived, the specific rhythm and weight of her steps. That he had been using this distinction since the 3rd week. She stood in the cold smokehouse for a moment with this information. How far away, she said. From the time you passed the old wall. Maybe 40 feet. And you know before I get here. Yes. She thought about this for a moment. What do you do when it's wrong? I'm already ready. She did not ask what ready meant in the context of a space with one exit and no weapons. The word did what it needed to do. She incorporated the system formally. She refined the distinction, made her normal approach slightly more specific in its sound so that the signal was cleaner, so that an unusual approach was more unambiguous. She added a secondary element, a coded knock for use when the approach had been interrupted and she was arriving later than expected. 2 slow, then 1 quick. The kind of sound that, heard through timber at a distance, sounded like a building settling in cold air. She explained this to him with the same directness she had brought to everything since the first night. He suggested a modification, a variation of the knock she could use when the delay was due to an active surveillance situation versus a simple timing change. The modification was so small that, overheard, it would be indistinguishable from the original. The difference was entirely within the logic of the system, legible only to the 2 people who had built it. She incorporated his modification. That was the moment, if she were to identify one later, when it became a collaboration. The supply audit that Gale conducted in January nearly ended everything. She had not anticipated it. Gale was not, in general, a systematic man, his oversight of the estate's resources was atmospheric rather than precise, based on general surveillance rather than careful accounting. But in January, acting on some instinct or some complaint she never traced to its source, he conducted a full inventory count of the grain stores. She found out about it the morning it was scheduled, from Curtis, in the specific wordless way that Curtis communicated things that needed to be communicated. She had 40 minutes. She went to the smokehouse immediately, during a window when Gale was at the far end of the property. "The grain stores," she said when she got inside. "He's counting today. I need to rebuild the number." The problem was simple and nearly unsolvable. She had been taking small amounts from the grain stores as part of the supply rotation, recording the amounts as consumed or spoiled in the household books, but the grain store register, which Gale had access to and which she did not fully control, reflected a slightly different number. The gap was small. Perhaps not large enough to raise a question. Perhaps exactly large enough. She did not have time to go verify the grain store register before the count. "What's the likely discrepancy?" he said. 2 to 3 bushels. "How does Gale count?" She thought about this. Volume estimate. "He doesn't weigh, he looks at the level in the barrels." "Then it's a visual gap, not an audited gap." "Yes. And the barrels?" "For barrels, different sizes." He said, "The smallest barrel. Is it possible the stave fitting has shrunk in the cold and it's reading low without an actual deficit?" She understood immediately. "Yes," she said. "Yes, it is." She went to the grain stores and spent 20 minutes with a small chisel slightly loosening the bottom stave fitting on the smallest barrel, enough to create a visible gap at the seam, enough to make the barrel read as slightly deficient due to the cold weather shrinkage that was, in fact, a real phenomenon that happened to wooden barrel staves in cold months. She was back at her desk before Gale began his count. His report to Ashby noted a slight low reading in one of the smaller barrels, attributed to cold weather affecting the stave fitting. He recommended the barrel be repaired in the spring. She had filed the report before she fully exhaled. That evening, she told Caleb what she had done. He listened. "You thought of the stave," he said. "You gave me the direction." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He won't count again soon. Men like Gale don't audit systems they think they understand. The stave explanation satisfies the question." "For now." "For now," he agreed. "But that's the only timeline we have." The spring of 1849 came with its particular demands. The planting season required the full mobilization of the estate's labor force, which meant the rhythms of the property became more intense, more supervised, more physically exhausting for everyone involved. It also meant Gale was more focused on the fields and less focused on the peripheral structures of the property, the old smokehouse, the south yard, the edges of the estate's attention. This gave the supply system room to breathe. But it also brought new pressure from above. The Richmond Bank sent its representative in February, a quiet, deliberate man named Hargrove who arrived in a good coat and communicated, more clearly in his manner than in his words, that the institution's patience with Ashby Hill's financial trajectory was approaching a definable end. He met with Ashby for most of an afternoon. Margaret was not in the room, but she had positioned herself near enough to the closed study door to hear the tone of the conversation even when she couldn't hear the words, and the tone was enough. Afterward, she found Ashby in the particular state she had learned to read as most dangerous, not drunk, exactly, or not only drunk, but in the specific held-together rage that had no legitimate outlet and therefore found whatever was available. She stayed away for 2 days. When she returned to her normal routines, she found the meeting's consequences and began to assess what the bank had actually required. An extension, contingent on a demonstrable improvement in the estate's operational presentation. A yield target for the spring tobacco that was, in reality, not achievable given the soil condition and equipment state. But achievable in documentation, if the documentation was constructed with sufficient sophistication. She began working on the spring accounts. She had begun, by this point, bringing her working papers to the smokehouse on evenings when Ashby was insensible and the yard was quiet, not the official ledgers, but the drafts, the trial calculations, the columns where she tested different framings before committing anything to ink. The lamp in the tin box was enough for close work. The repaired workbench held the papers flat. She had not told him what the papers were. She had simply brought them and worked. On the third evening, without her asking, he said, "The yield projections are based on last year's average." She looked up from the paper. "You've been reading over my shoulder," she said. "I've been reading what's on the table," he said. She absorbed this for a moment. "The yield projections are based on last year's average," she confirmed. Last year's average was low. Using it as a baseline makes the projected improvement look better than it is, but it also makes any actual improvement look worse than the projection suggested it would be. The bank will see that in the autumn numbers. She looked at the column in front of her. He was right. "What's the better framing?" she said. 5-year average minus the weather anomaly years. It's a longer baseline, but it's more defensible and it allows the projection to be presented as a recovery toward historical norms rather than an improvement on a recent low. She worked through the calculation. The framing he described produced a presentation that was, in fact, more accurate, and also considerably more sophisticated than anything Ashby Hill's accounts had previously generated. "You've done this kind of work before," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been in rooms where this kind of work was done," he said. She looked at him. He met her look steadily, with the quality of attention he brought to everything, not challenging, not defensive, simply present, simply clear, with the specific clarity of someone who has nothing left to perform. She went back to the calculation. She used his framing. The bank's representative, when he came in June, received a report that was, by the standards of Ashby Hill's previous documentation, remarkable. He left without a demand notice. He extended the situation by 3 months and used the word encouraging, which was the first time that word had appeared in any correspondence between the bank and Ashby Hill in living memory. Ashby took credit for it at dinner that evening. Margaret filed this in the part of her mind she maintained for information that was useful to know. By the summer of 1849, the system had achieved a quality she had not anticipated, normalcy. This needs to be understood carefully, because normalcy in these circumstances was not comfort. It was not safety. It was not the absence of danger. It was the condition in which danger had been integrated into the texture of daily life at a level where it ceased to announce itself and instead became the permanent background against which everything else occurred. She knew this condition. She had lived in a version of it for 6 years at Ashby Hill, the normalcy of managing an unstable man's estate, of working inside a system whose violence was ambient and unpredictable and always present as possibility. She had learned to function inside sustained risk with the particular competence that comes from having no alternative. What she had now was a more demanding version of the same thing. The supply deliveries followed no fixed schedule but maintained a frequency that fell within a rhythm, irregular enough to prevent pattern recognition, consistent enough that the absence of a delivery for more than 10 days was legible as a signal rather than a gap. The route through the South Yard had been refined across months of repetition, adjusted for seasonal changes in foot traffic, calibrated to the known positions of the people whose attention she needed to avoid. The smokehouse itself had been organized. Not obviously, nothing in the space would have declared occupancy to someone who opened the door. But within its logic, across the months of small modifications, it had become habitable in ways that went beyond bare survival. The pallet in the far corner. The water system. The lamp. The shelf of books, 14 by that summer, acquired through the same careful method as the first 2, old enough and obscure enough that their absence from the library created no visible gap. Caleb had been writing. She discovered this the way she discovered most things about the interior life of the smokehouse, not through being told, but through the change in the organization of the space. A pine board, smoothed on one surface, that hadn't been there before. Charcoal marks visible in the lamplight when she arrived one evening and found the board briefly uncovered before it was turned face down. She said nothing. He said nothing. The pine board was face down under the pallet when she arrived after that. She understood this as privacy rather than secrecy, understood it as the necessary preservation of something interior, something that belonged to him alone, in a situation that had stripped almost everything else away. She did not ask to see what he wrote. She did not ask whether it was words or plans or records or something else entirely. There are things a person keeps for themselves even when they have nothing. Especially when they have nothing. The summer of 1849 brought Robert Fell. He arrived from Charlottesville in August, Ashby's cousin, technically, with an old family claim against one of the estate's outer parcels that had never been fully resolved. His stated purpose was assessment. His actual purpose, Margaret understood within hours of his arrival, was observation. He was in his late 30s, quiet in the particular way that is different from reserve, the quietness of someone who has decided that what other people say is less interesting than what they do. He moved through the estate on his second morning with a deliberate, unhurried attention to physical detail that made Margaret uncomfortable in a way she couldn't attribute to a single thing. It was aggregate, the way he noticed surfaces, the way he registered the relationship between what was claimed and what was visible, the way he paused at things other visitors walked past. He asked, at dinner on the third evening, about the South End structures. Not specifically. As part of a general inquiry about the estate's underutilized assets. But the question was there, and Margaret heard it land with a precision she felt in her sternum. She spent the next 2 evenings working through every possible configuration of the situation. She mapped Fell's movements as best she could, tracking the pattern of his walks and his conversations and the specific locations where his attention seemed to rest. On the 4th day, she saw him walking toward the south yard. She moved. Through the back hallway, out the side door, across the yard in the kind of deliberate, purposeful walk that communicates legitimate business without urgency. She reached the smokehouse door and opened it and stepped inside. He had heard her coming. The space was what it appeared to be. Nothing was visible. The far corner was dark. The pallet, the lamp, the water system, the books, all of it was in positions she had established months earlier as the positions it would occupy if the building were simply what it appeared to be. Fell appeared at the door behind her. "Inventory work," she said, without turning. She had a pen in her hand and her working paper on the near shelf, and she was writing on it with the focused attention of someone absorbed in a task she had been in the middle of when interrupted. "I've been trying to get an accurate catalog of what's still functional down here." He stood in the doorway. She could feel his attention moving through the space the way you feel weather, not as a single specific sensation but as a composite pressure. "Original function," he said. "Smokehouse, historically. The estate stopped using it for that purpose several years before I arrived. The equipment against the back wall. Mostly non-functional," she said. "Some of the metalwork might yield scrap value. I've been documenting it." He looked at the space for a long moment. She kept her pen moving. The seconds had a particular quality, each one complete in itself, each one containing the full weight of everything that was not visible in the far corner of the room, the full weight of 8 months of careful work and carefully managed fear, all of it compressed into the span of a man standing in a doorway deciding what he was seeing. He left. She stood at the near shelf for 20 minutes after he walked away, her pen still moving across the inventory list, her handwriting steady and legible and completely accurate. The far corner made no sound. It never did. Fell stayed 11 days. The 11 days were the most sustained period of danger the arrangement had yet faced, and they required a quality of sustained performance that Margaret had not previously been asked to produce. Because Fell was not like Gale, he was not looking for anything specific, which made him harder to manage. A man looking for something specific can be deflected by the absence of that thing. A man with generalized attention deflects nothing. He accumulates. She managed him through activity. She made herself visible to him, productive, purposeful, always occupied with legitimate tasks that kept her in the parts of the estate she needed him to associate with her presence. She produced a comprehensive written assessment of the South End structures for Ashby's records and mentioned, in Fell's hearing, that she had submitted it so that any inquiry from the family about the outer assets could be answered directly without requiring a walk to that part of the property. Fell received a copy. He read it. She had included a small structural inconsistency, a measurement discrepancy, to test whether he would read with enough attention to catch it. He did catch it. She saw him pause and go back. Then he moved on. He chose to trust the document. She had been ready for him not to. After he left, the carriage pulling away down the estate drive on a gray morning in late August, she went directly to the smokehouse. She sat down on the edge of the workbench and stayed there for several minutes without speaking. He was in the far corner, as he always was, and he was watching her with the specific attentiveness he brought to her emotional state when it was different from what he expected. 11 days, she said finally. 11 days, he agreed. He didn't find anything. He didn't find anything. She looked at the wall across from her. He was close. Yes. He's going to send a letter about the land records. Within the month. Probably, he said. But the letter is the right kind of problem. A letter can be managed. She looked at him. You're not frightened, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm frightened every day. I've been frightened every day for almost a year. He paused. But frightened and incapacitated are different things. She held this. Yes, she said. They are. The year 1850 brought the Fugitive Slave Act. She read the full text when it arrived in the newspapers that came to Ashby Hill in October. She had been routing papers through the smokehouse since the first winter, a practice that had begun as supply and become, over the months, a kind of lifeline to the world outside the property's fence lines. He read the newspapers with the same consuming attention he brought to everything. On a cold October evening, she read the relevant sections of the act aloud, quietly, with the tin lamp between them and rain starting again outside. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. The rain built against the roof above them. How does this change your exposure? He said. She had expected this question. He always asked about her situation first. She had spent months, by this point, understanding why. Not because he was being performatively considerate. Because he understood the architecture of the arrangement clearly, her capacity to maintain it was the structural precondition of his survival. Her situation wasn't secondary to his. It was the foundation his situation stood on. Attending to her foundation was the most precise form of self-preservation available to him. Understanding this had changed something in the way she thought about their collaboration. The penalty provisions, she said. Federal enforcement means the exposure isn't limited to what Ashby or Gale might pursue on their own. There are federal commissioners now, federal marshals. If anyone makes a formal report and it's investigated thoroughly. Which requires someone reconsidering the original conclusion, he said. Yes. Gale concluded I went north in 1848. That conclusion is in the record. Changing it requires him to admit he was wrong. Or requires someone with enough authority to override his original report. Fell. She looked at him. The letter he sends about the land records, he said. If it generates enough official attention to bring an investigator to the estate, the investigator isn't coming just for the land records. She had not followed this chain to its end. He comes for everything, she said. He comes with fresh eyes. He's not Gale. He's not starting with the conclusion that the man ran north. He's starting with no conclusion. She absorbed this. How long before Fell's letter produces that kind of response? Months, he said. Maybe longer. County officials move slowly on land disputes. But it's a timeline. Which means we have a timeline. Which means, he said carefully, that we should start thinking about when, not whether. It was the first time either of them had said this. The rain came down on the roof. She looked at the lamp's small punctured light moving on the wall. Not yet, she said. Not yet, he agreed. The winter of 1850 into 1851 had a particular character. This is where the story requires patience from the teller as much as from the audience, because the middle years of a sustained concealment are not made of dramatic events. They are made of weather, and routine, and the slow, grinding work of maintaining something that grows heavier with every day that passes without being discovered. Let the weight of that settle. 1 year of it is extraordinary. 2 years is almost incomprehensible. 3 years begins to alter the basic structure of a person's interior life in ways that are not fully reversible. What does it do to a person, to live inside a lie of that scale across entire seasons? Not a momentary lie. Not a concealment that lasts days or weeks. 3 years of sustained management, of every supply entry, every maintenance report, every conversation with Gale, every response to Ashby's mercurial demands, every navigated risk and managed close call, all of it requiring the particular kind of sustained attention that leaves no room for the natural disorganization that being a human being involves. Margaret did not sleep well in those years. She had not slept well before. There was no version of life at Ashby Hill that produced restful sleep, for reasons that had nothing to do with the smokehouse. But after the first winter, sleep became something she had to approach deliberately rather than something that came to her, something she managed the way she managed the supply rotation and the ledger entries, with systematic attention and periodic assessment of whether the system was working. She was exhausted, chronically, in ways she could not show. And she was afraid, chronically, in ways she had to continue performing the absence of. The fear was not constant in its quality. There were mornings when the estate's routine was so predictable that the fear reduced to almost nothing, a low background hum, present but not demanding. And there were other mornings, the kind produced by a changed routine in Gale's movement, or an unexpected visitor's arrival, or something in Ashby's manner that suggested a new suspicion without specifying its object, when the fear was acute and immediate and physical, lodged in the chest and the base of the throat. She learned to work through both. She learned that the most dangerous state was not fear but the suppression of fear, the moment when the body's warning system was being overridden by the need to perform normalcy. She learned to read that state in herself and compensate for it with extra deliberateness, extra checking, an added layer of verification on everything she did in those windows. This cost her something. Not in any single dramatic way. Costs like this are not dramatic. They are cumulative, accruing in the way that compound interest accrues, invisibly for a long time, then suddenly, with consequences that feel sudden but aren't. What Caleb was doing in those years, in the smokehouse, was this. He was building a complete picture of Ashby Hill's financial situation. Not because Margaret had commissioned it. Because she had been bringing her working papers to the smokehouse for 2 years and he had been reading everything she brought, and because the human mind, certainly his mind, with its particular cast of systematic attention, does not simply absorb information. It organizes it. It builds structures from it. It generates, from the accumulation of supply records and bank reports and seasonal yield tallies and maintenance logs, a picture of the underlying reality that the documents partially describe. By the winter of 1851, he had a clearer picture of Ashby Hill's actual financial condition than Ashby did. Possibly clearer than anyone alive. He understood the soil exhaustion and its terminal implication for yield trajectories. He understood the Richmond Bank's patience and its limits. He understood the liens, the deferred payments, the informal obligations. He understood the labor force's capacity and the equipment constraints and the gap between what the estate claimed to produce and what it actually produced. And he understood the Pemberton arrangement. He knew about it before she told him. He had known about it for years. This emerged one evening in the early spring of 1852. She had come to the smokehouse in the aftermath of a meeting with a county official, a visit that had seemed routine but that had produced, in its final minutes, a question about one of the outer parcels that had made her go still in her chair. She sat down on the workbench and told him about the question. He listened. Then he said, "The Pemberton parcel." She looked at him. "How do you know about the Pemberton parcel?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was in the study 2 summers before all of this. Ashby left papers out. He believed I wasn't reading them. She absorbed this. What did you see? The transfer documents. The payment receipts. The county record that hadn't been updated. He paused. James Pemberton received the transfer payments as a buyer. But the parcels weren't transferred in the county records because Pemberton doesn't want his name on property that's exposed to the Richmond Bank's liens. He's waiting for the debt to collapse, for the price to fall, for formal title to become available at distressed rates. She was looking at him steadily. You've known this for 4 years, she said. Yes. And you didn't, she stopped. Tell anyone, he said. I had no one to tell it to who could use it. And telling someone who couldn't use it would have been dangerous in ways I didn't need. He paused. I didn't know, 4 years ago, that you were the person to tell it to. She heard this clearly, with what it meant and what it implied about the course of the previous years, the gradual calibration of trust, the patient construction of a basis for disclosure, the long, careful assessment that had preceded this conversation. He knows, Caleb said, meaning Ashby. About the desk. She went still. Not recently, he said. He noticed movement at some point. He changed the lock last winter. He blames Gale for the original intrusion. How do you know he blames Gale? Curtis. He said it simply, the name carrying the weight of a network of information that moved through the estate in channels Margaret could see only at their edges. She thought for a moment. Why are you telling me all of this now? He looked at her with a directness that was, by now, simply how he looked at her, no performance in it, no management of her reaction. Because the county official's question about the parcel means someone in Richmond is asking questions about the Pemberton arrangement from a different direction. Which means the arrangement has a limited time before it becomes visible. Which means the estate has a limited time before it collapses. He paused. And because when it collapses, the accounts will be examined. And your name is on the accounts. The smokehouse held its cold and its silence. You've been thinking about my situation, she said. You've been keeping me alive for 3.5 years, he said. It seemed appropriate. They began to plan. Not urgently, urgency was its own form of danger, the thing that produced mistakes, that moved faster than the situation could be managed. They planned the way they did everything, methodically, with sustained attention to the specific details that determined whether an approach was viable or not. The parameters were clear. His departure could not be visible, could not leave a trail, and could not create any record that connected the smokehouse to the main house or to Margaret. In the estate's official records, he had run north in November of 1848. That record had never been challenged. His departure needed to be consistent with that record, which meant it needed to look, to anyone who investigated afterward, like an absence that had always been there. Her own departure had different parameters. She could leave visibly, as a professional matter, with a resignation letter and the legitimate pretext of the unpaid salary arrears. But she needed to time it so that she was somewhere else before the estate's financial situation became visible enough to generate questions about the accounts she had managed. She had also, carefully and over the course of 18 months, been building a contact. A woman she had known before Ashby Hill, now in Baltimore, with whom she had maintained a correspondence that was unremarkable from the outside and that represented, from the inside, the slow construction of an alternative possibility, a life that existed outside this property, a place to go, a human being who would be there when she arrived. She told Caleb about the contact in the summer of 1852. She had waited until she was certain it was real. He listened to the full situation. Then he said, the transit north. There are people in Richmond, she said. I've been making contact through an indirect route for the past year. He was very still. How indirect, he said. 3 removes from my name. Nothing written. Nothing that connects to anything here. He absorbed this for a long moment. You've been building this since before we talked about leaving, he said. Yes. How long before? About a year before our conversation. He was quiet. You decided to build it before you told me, he said. I needed to know it was real before I told you, she said. Telling you when it wasn't real yet would have changed something I needed to stay the same. He held this. What would it have changed? She looked at him steadily, and answered him with the same directness he had always given her. Your hope, she said. I wasn't going to give you something I couldn't deliver. The smokehouse was very quiet. The lamp turned a slow light across the boards. After a long moment, he said, the Pemberton documents. There's a lawyer in Richmond who handles property disputes for the county assessor. He's been looking for documentation on the Pemberton transfers for 2 years. He looked at her. I know who he is, she said quietly. I know who he is too, he said. She almost smiled. Samuel Pruitt arrived in the spring of 1853. Gale had left the previous autumn, a departure that had its own murky context involving a wage dispute and a confrontation she was careful not to be present for. His replacement came recommended from a network of plantation management contacts in the lower Shenandoah Valley. Margaret knew within the first week that Pruitt was different. He was quieter than Gale. Less dramatic in his authority. He didn't announce himself. He arrived places and was simply there, already in the middle of observing something, already building his record of it. He carried a small notebook everywhere. She noticed this on his second day. A flat, cloth-covered notebook in his coat pocket, and the specific quality of attention that accompanied it, the attention of someone who is not only looking at what is in front of them but deciding what, in what they are looking at, is worth writing down. She told Caleb that evening. He's a counter, she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He's building a baseline. Yes. How long before he has enough baseline to generate anomalies? A month, she said. Maybe 6 weeks. Can we reduce the supply volume? Yes. But the reduction is real. I know. They tightened the system. Reduced the frequency and the quantities, redistributed the sources across more inventory categories, extended the intervals. The adjustment was real in its consequences, the food was less, the visits were rarer, the margin between sufficient and insufficient shrank. He didn't mention this. She noticed that he didn't mention it. Pruitt spent his 3rd week conducting a systematic walk of the full estate. Not a casual survey. A documented walk, notebook in hand, creating an inventory of every structure and assessing its condition and purpose. Margaret had known this was coming from the pattern of his movements in the first 2 weeks, the way a systematic man approaches a new environment, spiraling inward from the perimeter, building his understanding from the outside in. She submitted to Ashby, the morning before Pruitt reached the south yard, a written assessment of the outer structures that she had been constructing across the previous months for exactly this contingency. She framed it as completed routine inventory work and suggested that any inquiries from the new overseer could be directed to the document. Ashby accepted it and communicated accordingly to Pruitt. Pruitt received the document, read it, and paused at the measurement discrepancy she had planted. He went back and reread it. Then he moved on. But he didn't come to the south yard himself. He didn't come that week. She gave it 2 more weeks. He still didn't come. She understood then what was happening. Pruitt was the kind of man who received information and filed it and waited to see whether it would develop into a question worth pursuing. He was not convinced by her document. He was also not unconvinced. He was holding the document in a particular state of provisional acceptance that would last until something else in the system gave him a reason to revisit it. Everything in the system was designed to give him no such reason. But she also understood, with the cold, measuring clarity she had developed across 4.5 years of this kind of management, that a man like Pruitt, building a systematic baseline of a property's operations, was eventually going to find a gap. Not because she had made a mistake. Because gaps in physical supply systems are physical facts. They exist in matter. They can be obscured but they cannot be made not to exist. And Pruitt was the kind of man who, given enough time with a notebook, would eventually arrive at the gap. She told Caleb, we need a specific date. He didn't ask why. He knew why. How long, he said. The bank report is due in September. I need to produce it before I leave. That's the last anchor. Then October. October is difficult weather for the transit. August is better. She looked at him. The bank report. What if the report can be produced in advance? Built over the summer, ready to submit in September, but drafted before you leave. She thought about this. If the report is complete before August. You submit it remotely, he said. Or you're still here for the submission and you leave in the week after. She worked through the timeline. August, she said. Second week. Pruitt's second month produced the first near miss of his tenure. He came to the South Yard on a Tuesday morning in June, alone, notebook in hand. Margaret was in the main house. She had no warning. Curtis was on the far side of the property. Pruitt's movement had not followed his established pattern, and by the time she saw him through the window she had 30 seconds at most. She did not make it in time. She stood at the window and watched him approach the smokehouse door. Watched him lift the bar. Watched him push the door open. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. She could not see inside from where she was. She could see his face, the profile of it, the quality of attention on it. He was looking at something inside. He was deciding something. After a moment, he closed the door. He stood outside it for another few seconds, making a note in his book. Then he walked back toward the main building. She did not go to the smokehouse until that evening. She went through the knock sequence and opened the door. He was in the far corner, exactly where he always was. He came, she said. He came, he confirmed. What did he see? He looked at the workbench. He looked at the near shelving. He looked at the general organization of the space. And the far corner? Dark enough, if you're looking from the threshold and you're not specifically looking for it. He paused. But he wasn't satisfied. How do you know? He stood outside the door after he closed it. He was writing something. A man who was satisfied closes the door and moves on. She thought about this. He's going to come back. He's going to come back with better light, he said. Not soon. But eventually. She sat down on the workbench. How long does eventually give us? 6 weeks, he said. If we're lucky. Maybe 8. August, she said. August, he agreed. The summer of 1853 had the particular heat of Virginia's interior at its most unforgiving. Heavy air from mid-morning that pressed everything downward. The tobacco fields in full growth. The estate running at its highest summer intensity, which meant the property was more populated, more surveilled, more dense with the daily human traffic that made any unusual movement difficult to conceal. This was the most dangerous time in 5 years. She was aware of this in everything she did. It was present in the morning when she rose and began the first calculations of the day. It was present in the ledger work and the supply management and every conversation with every person on the estate. It was present in a way that was different from the ordinary chronic fear of the previous years, sharper, more specific, carrying with it the particular weight of a timeline. The bank report took shape through June and July. She worked on it in the main house, at her desk, sometimes through the small hours. She worked on it in the smokehouse on evenings when the yard was clear. She brought him the drafts and he found things, framing issues, arithmetic vulnerabilities, contextual gaps that would invite questions she couldn't afford to be present to answer. The report was finished in the last week of July. It was the best document she had ever produced. She put it in the outgoing correspondence file with a covering letter and a submitted date of the second week of September. She had constructed it so that it required no follow-up from her, no clarifying correspondence, no meeting, nothing that would produce a question to which her absence would be the answer. Pruitt came back to the smokehouse on the 3rd of August. He came in the early afternoon with a lantern. Margaret was in the yard when she saw him heading south. She moved. But this time, the distance was wrong, the angle was wrong. She reached the smokehouse as he was already at the door. She kept walking toward him. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. "I wanted to ask you about the fence line on the east parcel. Do you have a moment?" He turned to look at her. His expression registered her approach with the lateral attention she had been watching for 5 months, a quick, precise calibration of where she had come from and how fast she had been moving. "After this," he said, and turned back to the door. She stood behind him as he opened it. He went inside with the lantern. She followed him in. The lantern threw a wider, less forgiving light than the midday threshold had. It reached the far corner. She was aware of everything in that moment simultaneously, the specific positions of every object in the space, the position of the far corner and what it contained and what its darkness would and would not conceal under direct lantern light, and Pruitt beside her, sweeping the lantern slowly, methodically, with the baseline building attention of a man who knows what a disused space should look like and is checking what this one actually looks like. "The shelf positioning changed," he said. Without looking at her. Still sweeping the lantern. "I reorganized the near shelving when I finished the inventory assessment," she said. "The original arrangement made it difficult to access the back items." "When was the assessment completed?" "April." He looked at the near shelving. He looked at the workbench. The lantern moved toward the far corner. "The floor," he said. She looked at what he was looking at, the far corner's floor. The compressed straw, the pallet, the specific slight impression in the dirt that 5 years of occupancy had produced and that she had done what she could to erase but that remained, to a careful eye, subtly wrong in its texture compared to the rest of the space. "Storage," she said. "I had some grain sacks stored back there over the winter. The weight compresses the floor." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the floor. He looked at the workbench. He looked at the shelf. She stood beside him and looked at all of the same things with the expression of someone whose professional attention is engaged and who is mildly interested in what a competent overseer notices. He closed the lantern shutter to a narrower angle. The far corner went darker. She breathed. "The fence line question," she said quietly. "I'll let you finish here." He looked at her. She had timed it correctly. Not an urgent redirect, not an interruption, but the natural closing of a brief shared task by the senior domestic manager, mildly efficient, slightly indifferent. He came out. She walked with him to the east fence line and asked her question, which was a real question, a question she had prepared, a question about a section of fence that needed actual maintenance and that generated a legitimate conversation that lasted 12 minutes and ended with Pruitt making a note in his book and walking away to check the section himself. She went back to the main house. She sat at her desk and held herself very still for a long time. That evening she went to the smokehouse and sat down on the workbench. He was watching her. "He looked at the floor," she said. "I know." He almost. "I know." She looked at the far corner. She looked at the floor where Pruitt's lantern had reached. "We can't have another month," she said. "No," he agreed. "The storm system. I've been watching the sky since yesterday." "How long?" 3 days. Maybe 4. Then it comes. He was quiet for a moment. "Is the contact confirmed?" "Confirmed for the second week of August, within a 4-day window. I sent the final confirmation through the third remove 2 weeks ago." He nodded slowly. "The documents." "Ready," she said. "Sealed. I send them the night before you leave. Different routes to 2 different addresses." He absorbed this. "Walk me through the route one more time," he said. She did. The full route, every detail, every distance, every terrain feature, every choice point and contingency. He listened and then gave it back to her, exactly, in sequence. She listened to her own route in his voice and felt, for the first time since November of 1848, the particular weight of something that might actually end, not in disaster, but in an actual ending. A planned one. One she had built. The storm came on the 11th of August, 2 days after she had watched the western sky confirm it. She spent the 11th making the final preparations. In the smokehouse, during a window when Pruitt was at the north end of the property and Ashby was in his afternoon fog, she brought the final supplies, the contacts, the money, the clothes. The tin box. He looked at it. "That's yours," he said. "Some of it is yours. You built the reports that kept this estate solvent long enough for us both to get out. I don't need. You'll need to eat between here and Richmond," she said. "Take it." He took it. She looked around the smokehouse. The pine writing board, face down against the wall. The lamp in its tin box, cold and dark. The books on the shelf, some would stay, positioned to read as having always been there. The pallet, dismantled. She had said, 5 years ago, one night. "The route," she said. He said, "I know it." "Tell me." He told her. Exactly. Every step. She listened to him and understood that she had been telling herself a version of this story, a version in which she was the one with the knowledge, the one with the plan, the one maintaining the arrangement through the force of her competence, and that the version was not wrong but it was incomplete. He had known the route better than she had told it to him since the day she first described it. He had been refining it, in his mind, across the weeks she had been building toward this date. He had been ready for longer than she knew. "There's one thing," he said. She looked at him. "The pine board," he said. He reached under the pallet and brought out the writing board. He turned it face up. She looked at it in the lamplight. It was a record. Not of events, not a diary, not a confession, not anything that named names or dates or locations. It was a set of accounts. The supply amounts, the timing intervals, the inventory adjustments, every small element of the system's operation across 5 years, recorded in the compressed, precise shorthand of someone who understood that a record needed to be accurate but not legible to an uninitiated reader. A record that only she would understand. "Why?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Because it happened," he said. "And someone who lived it should have a record of it." She held the board for a long moment. She smoothed the surface with her thumb. She took it. He left at 10:15. She watched him cross the south yard through the first rain, moving exactly on the route, exactly as she had mapped it, with the steady unhurried precision of someone who is not fleeing but traveling, someone who knows where he is going and has chosen to go there. He reached the south wall. He did not look back. She stood in the doorway of the smokehouse until the rain was too heavy to see anything and the yard was simply dark and water. Then she came inside and spent 2 hours making the space what it needed to be. She cleaned every surface. She repositioned every object. She smoothed the floor of the far corner with the flat side of the broken workbench's leg, working slowly and thoroughly in the lamplight, erasing the compressed impression that 5 years had made. When she was done, she stood in the middle of the space and looked at it. Cold. Empty. The smell of old timber and old smoke. In the far corner, the folded blanket she had decided to leave, the one that was old enough to have been there before any of this, the one that could simply be a blanket, the one that required no explanation. She turned the lamp off. She carried it out. She walked back to the main house through the rain and sat at her desk and worked on correspondence until dawn. She was gone by the following Saturday. The resignation letter was placed in the household correspondence that morning, professionally worded, citing the unpaid salary arrears, framed with the formal correctness of someone who has managed correspondence for 6 years and knows the precise weight of every word. She walked out the front gate at first light with 2 bags and the leather case of her personal papers. The Pemberton documents had been sent the previous evening. 2 sealed packets, delivered through the third remove, addressed to 2 different recipients in Richmond. One to the lawyer who handled property disputes for the county assessor. One to a contact in the county's free black community who had the connections to put the information where it could travel. The Richmond lawyer received his packet 3 weeks later. The picture that emerged from the documents took time to fully reconstruct, the kind of time required when evidence has been deliberately fragmented across multiple administrative systems designed not to speak to each other. But the picture, once reconstructed, was clear. Clear enough to generate a civil action. Clear enough to require James Pemberton to formalize the land transfers and pay the outstanding assessments at full value rather than waiting for a distressed price. Clear enough to do considerable damage to the financial arrangements through which certain Virginia county transfers had been operating. Ashby Hill was leaned in early 1855. The estate did not survive another full year. Its collapse was the ordinary collapse of a failing plantation, from the outside, bad yields, accumulated debt, a financial structure that had been unsustainable for years finally reaching its terminal point. The accounts were examined. Discrepancies were attributed to poor management, general disorder, the administrative inadequacy of an estate that had clearly been in decline for years. The smokehouse was noted in the property inventory. Disused outbuilding. Old equipment. Broken workbench. No assessed value. There is something in that empty room that no inventory can contain. The cold morning light coming through the cracks in the timber. The dust turning slowly in the air. The blanket folded in the far corner with the specific, careful fold of someone who was raised to leave things the way they would want to find them. Someone lived here for 5 years. Not hiding, existing. Thinking, calculating, reading, writing, managing the financial analysis of an estate from inside its walls, keeping careful records on a smoothed pine board in compressed shorthand that only one other person could read. Someone walked into this space on a night of November rain in 1848 and chose to close the door behind her. She made that choice again every night for 5 years. Not out of sentiment. Not out of the kind of abstract moral conviction that comes cheaply when nothing is at stake. Out of the specific, material, daily recognition that what was happening on the other side of that door mattered, that the person on the other side of that door was the most capable, the most strategically precise, the most intellectually rigorous person she had encountered in 6 years on this estate, and that the system surrounding both of them was organized around making that recognition impossible. She made the system wrong. Not heroically. Not in a single dramatic moment. In 5 years of supply entries and false inventory counts and coded knocks and careful route mapping and bank reports and the slow, patient construction of an exit that worked. The estate collapsed. The man who had been declared absent in 1848 was, by the time the estate collapsed, living in a city whose name was not in any of Ashby Hill's records. Living under a name that wasn't in any of Ashby Hill's records. Working. The system had declared him absent. He had used the time the system gave him. That is not coincidence. That is what intelligence looks like when it has been given nothing to work with except time and the particular quality of attention that refuses to be wasted. The blanket is still there, in the accounting. Noted as worthless. Noted as having no value. The auditors were wrong about almost everything in that room. If this story stayed with you, leave it in the comments. Not the feeling of it, if you don't want to put that into words. Just this, at what point did you understand that he was already protecting her, before she understood it herself? Subscribe to Unmarked History. We find the rooms that history marked as empty. We find out who was there.